The night Dorothy Graves pressed her palms flat against the worn pine counter of the Caldwell boarding house and told Louis Shepard she was leaving. He felt something collapse inside his chest that no bullet wound, no cannon blast, and no cold winter on the Kansas plains had ever managed to reach. It was the spring of 1878 in Caldwell, Kansas, a cattle town that sat just north of the Cherokee Strip like a man balanced on the edge of a cliff, loud and reckless, and full of the kind of dust that settled into your skin and never quite left. The Kishom Trail ran right through its heart, and every summer the longhorns came through in rivers of hooves and horns, and the cowboys came with them, dirty and sun-dried, and looking for whiskey and a soft place to sleep. Dorothy had been running the Graves boarding house since her father passed 2 winters prior, and she had learned in that time that the world was not soft, and that a woman alone had to be made of something harder than sentiment. Louis Shepard had ridden into Caldwell in October of the previous year with nothing but a bedroll, a dun-colored horse named Cass, and a look in his eyes that Dorothy had recognized immediately, the look of a man who had seen something he could not unsee. She had seen it on other men who drifted through. Veterans of the war between the states, men who had ridden with cavalry units along the frontier, men who had buried brothers in the red Georgia mud or the frozen hills of Tennessee. Louis was 31 years old, broad-shouldered and lean, with dark hair that curled at his collar and a jaw that always seemed set against something invisible. He had served with the Union infantry at the Battle of Franklin in 1864, and he had come home to Missouri to find his family's farm sold for taxes and his mother buried 6 months in the ground. He had drifted west after that, doing what drifting men did, working cattle drives, picking up work as a ranch hand, riding fence lines for outfits that didn't ask too many questions. He had taken a room at the Graves boarding house for $1.50 a week, which included 2 meals a day and the use of the wash basin in the hall. Dorothy had shown him the room herself, opening the door with a small iron key that she kept on a ring at her hip alongside a dozen others. She had told him supper was at 6 and that she did not tolerate drinking on the premises, card playing in the common room after 9, or language that would embarrass a decent person. Louis had looked at her, then really looked at her, and she had looked back at him with brown eyes that were perfectly clear and perfectly unwilling to be read, and he had said, "Yes, ma'am," and that had been that. She was 26, with dark brown hair that she wore pinned back in a practical knot, a strong straight nose, and hands that were always moving, folding laundry, stirring pots, writing figures in the leather-bound ledger she kept on the kitchen table. She was not a woman who performed softness, but she was not without it. Louis had noticed it in the small things first. The way she left an extra biscuit on the plate of old Harlan McCready, who was 80 and had a hard time getting enough down to keep his weight up. The way she kept a small glass of dried wildflowers on the windowsill of the parlor even in winter, when the world outside was nothing but gray and brown. The way she sometimes stood on the back porch at dusk and looked at the western sky like she was reading something written there. Louis had not prayed since the Battle of Franklin, not once. He had gone into that battle as a young man who believed in providence and come out of it 3 hours later with blood on his coat that was not his own and a silence inside himself where faith had once lived. He had watched men he loved die in a frontal charge against fortified Confederate positions, had seen the kind of things that made a person question whether any God worth praying to could look down on that field and call it part of a plan. He had not hated God after Franklin. He had simply stopped speaking to him, the way a man stops writing letters to someone he is not sure is receiving them. He had spent the winter at the Graves boarding house quietly, keeping mostly to himself, working days at the Reeder Cattle Company on the south edge of town, breaking horses for a man named Cal Reeder who paid fair wages and did not ask for conversation. Evenings he would come back, wash up, sit at supper with whatever boarders were passing through, and then sit in the parlor for a while with a book or the Caldwell paper before going to bed. He did not drink. He did not carouse. He was polite and quiet and remarkably good at fixing things. Twice, he had repaired the front porch steps without being asked, and once he had hauled a sack of flour up from the mercantile for Dorothy when her regular delivery boy had taken ill, setting it on the kitchen table without fanfare, and then going back outside to split firewood. Dorothy had noticed. She was a woman who noticed everything, because noticing everything was how she had survived the past 2 years alone. She noticed that he read the same page of whatever book he was holding sometimes for 20 minutes without turning it. She noticed that he slept badly. She could hear his boots on the floor overhead when the house was quiet, pacing at 2 and 3 in the morning, the soft, heavy sound of a man who could not find peace. She noticed that he never spoke about his past unless directly asked, and even then gave answers that were true but incomplete, like a man handing you one piece of a map. She noticed, too, that he watched her. Not with anything improper in it. Louis Shepard was not that kind of man, but with a quiet attention that she felt on her skin the way you feel a fire's warmth from across a room. It began slowly, the way things begin between careful people. A longer conversation at supper one evening in December, when the other boarders had finished and gone, and Dorothy was clearing the table and Louis was still sitting with his coffee. She had made a remark about a notice in the newspaper, something about the new railroad spur being discussed for Caldwell, and he had said something thoughtful in response. And then she had sat back down, just for a moment, and the moment had stretched into an hour. He had told her that night about Missouri, about the farm, about his mother. Not about the battle, not yet, but the edges of it, the years after, the drifting. He had told it plainly, without self-pity, which she respected more than she would have respected grief. And she had told him about her father, about learning the business of the boarding house from scratch, about the loneliness of it. A word she had not said aloud to anyone in 2 years, and his eyes had gone very attentive when she said it, as if he understood the specific weight of that word in a way most people did not. After that, they talked every evening. Not always for long, not always about anything weighty, but there was a regularity to it that felt, to both of them, like water, like something necessary. He started helping her without being asked, not in an intrusive way, but in the way of someone who simply sees what needs doing and does it. He repaired the hinge on the back door. He rebuilt the fence along the side yard. On a cold January morning when the hand pump at the well froze, he spent 2 hours out in the gray cold with a pot of hot water and a determination that was almost moving to watch, and got it running again before Dorothy had even fully comprehended the problem. She began to let herself enjoy his company, which was a thing she had to allow herself consciously, because enjoyment felt dangerous to a woman who had learned to expect loss. By February, she had started saving the good coffee for the evenings when only she and Louis were in the kitchen, and she was aware of this and chose not to examine it too carefully. By March, she knew she was in love with him, and she found this knowledge both beautiful and terrifying, as the truest things often are. Louis, for his part, had known it longer. He had known it sometime in January, maybe earlier, maybe the very first day she had looked at him with those clear brown eyes and told him supper was at 6. He was not a man who fell easily or quickly or without thought, but Dorothy Graves was not a woman you fell for easily or quickly or without thought. She demanded that you be real with her, demanded that you be present, and the demand of it had pulled something alive in him that he had thought was gone for good. He had not told her. He was not sure how. He was not sure what he had to offer a woman like her, a woman who had built something real and solid and good out of hard circumstances, who ran a proper establishment, who was known and respected in Caldwell. He was a drifting man with no property and a past he kept in a locked room inside himself. He did not think himself good enough for her, and this thought lived in him constantly, like a stone in his boot. Spring came, and with it the cattle drives. The town filled up with trail hands and noise and the smell of longhorn and horse sweat, and the boarding house was full every night. Dorothy was busy from before dawn until after dark, and Louis picked up extra hours at the reader outfit helping manage the incoming herds, and they saw each other less but felt each other's absence more, which was its own kind of knowledge. It was on a warm evening in late April, after the supper dishes were done and the other boarders had gone to bed, that Louis finally said something. They were on the back porch, both of them sitting in the two wooden chairs Dorothy kept there, looking out at the dark Kansas sky, which was enormous and full of stars and completely indifferent to human nervousness. He had been trying to build up to something for 30 minutes and had been failing badly at it, talking around whatever the thing was, and Dorothy had finally looked at him sideways in the dark and said, "Louis, what is it you are trying to say?" And he had said, "I think you are the finest person I have ever met, Dorothy, and I am not sure I am good enough to tell you so." She had been quiet for a long moment after that, long enough that he had started to regret saying it. Then she had said, "I have heard better declarations of affection." And he had laughed a real laugh, surprised out of him, and she had smiled in the dark, and then she had said more quietly, "But I have not heard one that felt more honest." After that, things between them were different. Not dramatically different, not with the kind of theatrical suddenness that happened in the dime novels some of the boarders left behind, but different in the way that a room is different when a window is opened. There was air in it now. There was a new warmth. He walked her to the mercantile and carried her basket. She saved him the chair by the parlor window that caught the afternoon light, because she had noticed him reading there one Sunday afternoon, and had seen the way the light fell on him, and decided, without much deliberation, that the chair was his. He brought her a small bunch of prairie wildflowers one evening in early May, looking so uncertain about the gesture that she had taken them from him quickly so he would not have to stand there with them any longer, and had put them in the glass on the windowsill in place of the dried ones, and the look on his face when he noticed this, a quiet, moved look, almost startled, had done something to her that she thought about for days afterward. He kissed her for the first time in the side yard on a warm May evening, just after sunset, while she was taking down the dry laundry from the line, and he had come around the corner of the house, and they had nearly collided. He had caught her by the arms to steady her, and they had stood there very close in the fading light, and he had said her name once, just Dorothy, low and careful, like it was something precious, and then he had kissed her, and she had kissed him back, and the laundry remained on the line another hour before either of them remembered it. He told her about Franklin in June. They were sitting on the back porch late on a Sunday evening, the kind of evening that was all soft air and cricket song, and he had started talking about Missouri again, and then something had shifted and he had kept going, further back than he usually went, until he was in Tennessee in November of 1864, in front of the Carter house, watching the men around him fall. He told it quietly and factually and without flinching, though she could see by the set of his jaw that the factual telling of it cost him something. He told her about the specific men he had lost. A boy named Elias from his own county in Missouri, 17 years old, who had been beside him at the start of the charge and gone down in the first minute. A sergeant named Colby, who had been a school teacher before the war and who sang hymns in the morning and had died with his face turned up to the sky. He said, "I stopped praying after that. I have not prayed since. I know that might be a thing that matters to you, and I wanted you to know it." She had looked at him for a long time in the dark. Then she had said, "What matters to me is that you are honest with me. You have been. That matters more than most anything else." He had exhaled something that might have been relief, might have been gratitude. She had reached across and taken his hand, and they had sat there together until the moon was high, not talking, which was sometimes better than talking. Things continued to be good through the summer, better than good. Louis asked Cal Reeder if there was a permanent position at the outfit, and Reeder, who had come to appreciate Louis's work and his steadiness, offered him a foreman's position starting in July. It was a real job, a respectable job, with a wage that could actually build towards something. Louis came home that evening. He thought of the boarding house as home now, which was a thing he had not thought about a place since Missouri, and told Dorothy, and she had looked at him with a brightness in her eyes that he could have lived inside of happily for the rest of his life. He had been saving towards something. He had not told her what, but she was perceptive enough to have a guess, and the guess made her feel warm and frightened in equal measure. What she had not told Louis was that she had received a letter in June from a man named Bernard Hollis, who was a land buyer out of Wichita. Hollis had written to her father 2 years ago about the Graves property, not just the boarding house but the quarter section of land her father had owned east of town. Her father had ignored the letter. Dorothy had found it in his papers after he died and had filed it away and tried not to think about it. But Hollis had written again in June, this time to Dorothy directly, offering $450 for the property. It was more money than Dorothy had seen in 2 years of running the boarding house. It was enough to pay the debt she owed on the building's roof, which needed replacing, and still have money left over. But it would mean selling the property, and she was not certain she wanted to do that. What she was also not telling Louis was that she had a sister, Clara Graves, 3 years her junior, who had married a man named Preston Alvarado and moved with him to Santa Fe in 1875. Clara had written in July, a long, breathless letter full of news, the most important piece of which was that Preston had secured a position managing a freighting company out of Santa Fe, and that Clara wanted Dorothy to come. Not to visit, to come and live. Clara had written that there was a room for her, that Santa Fe was growing and warm and full of possibility, that she should not spend her life alone in a dusty Kansas cattle town. Dorothy had read the letter 3 times and then put it in the drawer beneath the ledger and not taken it out again for 3 weeks. She took it out in late July, on a hot, breathless afternoon when the cattle drives were at their loudest, and the boarding house was crammed with trail hands, and the town smelled like manure, and the summer had been so dry that the ground was cracking in long, pale lines, and everything felt hard and heavy and exhausting. She read Clara's letter again and felt something pull at her, not just tiredness, but the longing for something different, for something easier, for a sister, for something that felt like being loved by someone who had known her whole life instead of just a piece of it. She had not yet told Louis about the letter. She had not told him because she did not know yet what she was going to do, and she was afraid of what telling him might mean, both if she decided to stay and if she decided to go. If she stayed, she would be staying for him, at least in part, and the thought of being a woman who gave up a choice for a man before the man had properly made her any promises was a thought she could not quite bring herself to be comfortable with. And if she went, if she told him she was going, she was afraid of what she might see in his face, and more afraid that she might let what she saw there be the thing that decided her. Louis could see that something was weighing on her in August. She was present but slightly withdrawn, thoughtful in a way that was different from her usual thoughtfulness. He asked her once if everything was all right, and she said yes. It was just tired, and he had let it go because he trusted her to tell him things in her own time, which was one of the things he had learned about Dorothy Graves. She could not be crowded, could not be pressed, had to come to things on her own terms. He had been working up to asking her to marry him. He had been working up to it for 2 months, had in fact visited the jeweler in town, a German man named Brower, and had looked at a simple ring with a small garnet stone, and thought about it for a long time before deciding to wait until he had another month's wages saved. He wanted to have enough for the ring and still have something to bring to the conversation, some concrete sense of what he was offering her. The letter from Bernard Hollis sat in Dorothy's drawer. Clara's letter sat beside it. And in August, another letter arrived, this one from a man Dorothy had not expected to hear from, a lawyer in Wichita named Carter, who informed her that the Graves property had a lien she had not known about, filed by a creditor of her father's from before the war, a debt of $200 that had accumulated interest and now stood at $263, which was due within 90 days or the property could be seized. Dorothy read that letter on the porch on a Tuesday afternoon and felt the ground shift under her feet in a way that was entirely interior, entirely silent, and entirely devastating. $263. She could not cover it from the boarding house income alone, not in 90 days. She could sell the property to Holly's for $450 and pay the debt and have money left over and still have the boarding house building itself, which was on a separate deed. Or she could try to borrow the money, which meant going to the bank in Caldwell, which meant speaking to Franklin Dunn, the bank manager, who she did not trust and who she was fairly certain had been waiting for an opportunity to put pressure on any female property owner in town. She had a third option, which was also in her drawer. She had not taken it out, but she knew it was there. Clara's letter, the room in Santa Fe, the freighting company in Preston, Alvarado's position, and the possibility of a life that was not entirely her own responsibility to build from scratch in a cracking, dry Kansas cattle town. She spent 4 days trying to work it out in her head, running numbers in the ledger late at night after everyone was asleep, and at the end of those 4 days, she still had not found a comfortable answer. The most logical thing was to sell the property to Holly's, but selling the property meant losing the thing her father had built, the thing she had held onto for 2 years as a way of still being connected to him, and the grief of that felt out of proportion, but she could not make it smaller. On the 5th day, she made a decision. She would write to Clara and say she was coming. Not permanently, not necessarily, just to go, to have a change, to think clearly away from Caldwell and the weight of the debt and the dust and the noise. She could manage the sale of the property by correspondence. She could close the boarding house for the winter. She could go. She told herself this was a practical decision. She tried very hard not to examine how much of it was fear of what she had with Louis becoming something she could not afford to lose, which meant she might be trying to get away from it before it became that permanent. She went to Louis on a Wednesday evening in late August. She found him in the parlor with his book, and she sat across from him in the other chair, and she looked at him in the lamp light and she said, "I need to tell you something." He put his book down immediately. He had known something was coming. He had felt it building for weeks. She told him about the lien, about the debt, about Holly's offer, and about Clara's invitation. She told him clearly and without breaking her voice, which cost her more than she let show. She said that she thought she needed to go to Santa Fe, to think about what she wanted, to be with her sister for a while. Louis said nothing for a long moment. He had the look of a man who had received a blow he had half been expecting, but that hurt no less for the expectation. Then he said, "How long?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Dorothy, are you coming back?" She looked at him, and he could see in her face the thing she had been afraid of, that she did not know the answer to that question either, and that not knowing was not nothing. He said, "I see," and his voice was entirely level, and that levelness was the most painful thing she had heard in a long time. She said, "Louis, I am not doing this to hurt you. I hope you know that." He said, "I know that." He picked up his book again, which was not because he intended to read it, but because he needed something to hold. She went to bed. He did not. He sat in the parlor until the lamp burned low, and then he went upstairs to his room, and the room was dark and quiet, and he could hear the distant sound of Caldwell's saloon still open to the south, faint music and raised voices, and he stood at the window for a long time looking at nothing. He had not prayed in 14 years. Not once, not seriously, not with any real belief that the words were going somewhere. He had not prayed after Franklin, had not prayed when his mother died, had not prayed on a dozen cold, hard nights when prayer would have been a comfort if he had thought it would do any good. He had lived all this time without it, and he had been fine, or at least functional, which was close enough. But he found himself that night, this particular night, in August of 1878, in an upstairs room of the Graves boarding house in Caldwell, Kansas, sinking slowly to his knees on the bare wooden floor beside the bed. His hat still in his hands, his head bowed, and he said something. Not an eloquent thing. Not the kind of prayer a minister would recognize as such. He said quietly and entirely honestly, "I don't know if you're listening. I don't know if I have any right to ask anything, but I love her, and I don't know how to make this right. Help me know how to make this right." He stayed on his knees for a while. The floorboards were hard and the night was warm, and from somewhere outside a mockingbird was going through its entire repertoire in the dark. He didn't feel anything dramatic. No thunder, no vision, no sudden certainty. But something in his chest, that old locked room where the noise of Franklin had lived for 14 years, was slightly quieter, just slightly, just enough. He got up. He sat on the edge of the bed. He thought for a long time, and sometime around 2 in the morning, he stopped thinking around the thing and started thinking clearly, which was what happened when a man stopped pretending he was not afraid and just looked directly at the fear. He was afraid of asking too much of her. He was afraid of being the thing that kept her from a better life. He had spent months assuming he was not good enough for her, and that assumption had kept him from saying plainly and directly what he wanted, and what he was willing to do, and what he had to offer. He had been circling her with his affection and his quiet gestures and his careful attention, and he had not once said to her, directly and completely, what he felt or what he wanted their future to look like. She was making decisions in a vacuum that he had partly created by his own reticence, and if she left Caldwell not knowing what he was prepared to give, that was not entirely her failing. In the morning he got up before dawn, dressed quietly, and went downstairs. Dorothy was already in the kitchen, as she always was before dawn, starting the stove and setting the coffee pot. She looked at him when he came in, and he could see that she had not slept well either. He said, "Dorothy." "Sit down for a minute," she said. "The boarders will be wanting breakfast." He said, "It'll wait 5 minutes." She sat at the kitchen table. He sat across from her and he looked at her and he said, "I owe you an honest conversation. I should have had it months ago. I want to have it now." She folded her hands on the table and looked at him steadily. He said, "I love you. I have loved you for long enough that I should have told you clearly before now, and I am sorry that I did not. I have been holding back because I thought you deserved better than a man who has nothing but a foreman's wage and a horse, and a past he does not entirely know what to do with. But I have been working, and I have saved enough to offer you something real. I want to marry you, Dorothy. I want to build something with you, here in Caldwell or somewhere else if that is what you need, and I want you to know that before you decide anything." The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee pot was just starting to make its small sound of beginning to heat. Dorothy looked at him for a long time. Something was moving in her face, not breaking open. She was too controlled for that, but the edges of it were different, softer. She said, "You waited a long time to say that." He said, "I know, that is my fault." She said, "What about the debt, the boarding house?" He said, "I have $240 saved. I know it is not enough for the full debt, but it is most of it, and I have the foreman's wage coming in. We can go to Brower at the bank, and I think with the property as security, both deeds together, we can arrange the rest. And Holly's offer is still on the table for the east parcel if we decide to sell it. But there are options, Dorothy. There are ways through this that do not involve you going to Santa Fe alone and not knowing if you are coming back." She was quiet for another long moment. Then she said, "You went to the jeweler." He blinked. "How did you know that?" she said. "Mrs. Brower mentioned it to me in the mercantile." "I was not going to say anything," he exhaled. "How long ago?" she said. 3 weeks. He put his hands flat on the table. "And you did not say anything," she said. "I was not going to be the one to bring it up." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, somewhat helplessly, "Dorothy," she said, "I know." He said, "Are you going to Santa Fe?" She looked at him across the table in the early morning kitchen light, the coffee just beginning to smell like itself, the Caldwell morning starting to come through the windows in pale gold strips, and she said, "I want to write Clara and tell her I am not coming. I want to stay here." but I need to know that you are not going to spend the next 5 years being quietly uncertain about whether you are good enough for me, because I cannot live with a man who sees himself as less than he is. I will not be patient about that, Louis. I am telling you that plainly." He said, "I hear you," she said. "Do you believe that you are good enough for me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, honestly, "I believe I will spend my life trying to be." She looked at him. "That is the right answer." He reached across the table and took her hands in his, and she let him. And they sat there like that for a minute while the coffee heated and the morning came in through the windows. And outside, Caldwell was waking up, the town full of its regular noise of horses and voices, and the distant low sound of cattle from the Reeder outfit south of town. He said, "Will you marry me, Dorothy?" She said, "Yes." He exhaled as if he had been holding his breath since October. She squeezed his hands once and then stood up because the coffee was ready and the boarders would be wanting breakfast. And she went to the stove, and he watched her move around the kitchen and thought about the word yes, how small it was, and how it contained everything. They went together that afternoon to the bank. Not to Franklin Dunn, who Dorothy had correctly assessed as someone to be avoided. Instead, they went to the second bank in Caldwell, a smaller institution run by a man named August Heller who had a reputation for dealing fairly. Louis sat across from Heller and laid out the situation plainly. The two properties, the debt, his foreman's wage, and Heller had looked at the numbers and at Louis' steady gaze, and agreed to a loan arrangement that would cover the lien with the east parcel as additional collateral. The payment schedule was manageable. It was not easy, but it was manageable, and both of them left the bank that afternoon with the particular feeling of people who have solved a problem by simply facing it directly, which is always better than the anticipation of it. Dorothy wrote to Hollis that evening and told him the east parcel was not for sale at this time. She wrote to Clara and told her she was staying in Caldwell, that she was engaged to be married, and that she hoped very much that Clara and Preston would come for the wedding. She wrote both letters sitting at the kitchen table after supper, and Louis sat across from her reading the newspaper, and she was aware of him in the room with the particular warm awareness of someone who has recently been allowed to keep something they thought they might lose. They were married in October of 1878, exactly 1 year after Louis had ridden into Caldwell on his dun-colored horse. The ceremony was held at the small Methodist church on Main Street, with the minister officiating, and a congregation that included every permanent resident of Caldwell, who could cram into the pews, plus several trail hands from the Reeder outfit who had cleaned themselves up for the occasion, and sat in the back row looking scrubbed and slightly uncomfortable. Clara and Preston Alvarado had come up from Santa Fe on the stage, and Clara had cried from the moment Dorothy appeared in the doorway to the moment the minister said man and wife. And Preston had been a solid and cheerful presence throughout, toasting Louis so warmly at the small reception in the boarding house that Louis had felt genuinely welcomed by him. Cal Reeder had come to the wedding and had shaken Louis's hand afterward and said, "You are a good man, Shepard, and that is a woman who deserves one," which was not a flowery compliment but was Reeder's highest form of praise. The boarding house had a new sign on the front after the wedding, painted by a man in town who did fine lettering, SHEPARD House. Dorothy had insisted on including Louis's name in it, and Louis had stood in front of it the morning it went up and looked at it for a long time with the expression of a man reading his name in a place he had not expected to find it. The winter of 1878 and into 1879 was a busy season. The boarding house kept them occupied, and Louis's work at the Reeder outfit had expanded. Reeder was planning to drive a larger herd north in the spring, and Louis was to be his chief foreman, which meant planning and preparation work through the cold months and a good deal of travel between the outfit and the town. Dorothy managed the boarding house with her usual efficiency and began making improvements she had been putting off for 2 years. The roof was repaired in November using funds from the loan, which removed a weight from her shoulders she had been carrying so long she had partly forgotten it was there. She was happy. She was genuinely, fully, without reservation happy, which was a thing she had not been in long enough that she took stock of it regularly, in quiet moments, the way you take stock of something valuable to make sure you know exactly where it is. Louis was different too in ways that were small but real. He slept better, which she knew because the pacing overhead had stopped. He laughed more easily. He had gone back to the Methodist church on a Sunday in November, not with fanfare, just quietly, and had sat in the second-to-last pew and listened. And afterward the minister had shaken his hand at the door and not asked him where he had been, which Louis had appreciated. He did not go back every Sunday, but he went sometimes, and that was its own kind of start. One evening in February, sitting by the fire in the parlor with the wind coming off the prairie in long, cold sheets, he told Dorothy about the prayer, about being on his knees on the wooden floor the night she had said she was leaving. He told it matter-of-factly, the way he told all the difficult things, plainly, without dramatics, looking at her steadily while he said it. She had been quiet for a moment after he finished. Then she said, "What did you pray for?" He said. "I asked to know how to make it right," she said, "and did you?" He looked at her across the firelight and said, "I woke up the next morning with my head clear for the first time in months. I knew what I needed to say to you. I figured that was close enough to an answer." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I was so close to going." He said, "I know," she said. "I am glad you said what you said. I needed to hear it." He said, "I should have said it months earlier." She said, "Yes, you should have." But she was smiling when she said it, and he knew it was not a wound, just a fact, just something that was true and that neither of them needed to carry any more. The spring of 1879 brought the cattle drives back to Caldwell, and with them, all the noise and motion and commerce that made the town what it was. Louis rode north with the reader herd in May, a drive of nearly 3,000 head, and was gone for 6 weeks, and Dorothy managed the boarding house and wrote him letters that went to the nearest postal outpost on the route and received letters back from him, written in his careful, deliberate hand, that she kept in the drawer where Clara's letter had once been kept, them all, in order, rereading them on evenings when the house was quiet. He came back in late June, thinner and sun-darkened and tired in his bones, and she stood at the front gate of the Shepard house when she heard Cass's hooves on the street and watched him ride up and dismount. And when he came through the gate she put her arms around him without any preamble and felt him exhale against her hair, and he said, "I missed you every single day," and she said, "I know. I missed you too," which was more than she would have said a year ago, and both of them knew it. In the autumn of 1879, Dorothy told him she was expecting a child. She told him on the back porch, their porch, the place where so many things had been said between them. She told him quietly, watching his face, a little afraid of what she would see there, not because she doubted him, but because she had learned that happiness sometimes frightened her at the moment of its fullest arrival, as if she were waiting for the other thing to come and balance it. What she saw in his face was not what she had feared. What she saw was something she did not have a clean word for. It was large and steady and entirely without reservation, a kind of arrival, as if a thing he had not known he was waiting for had finally appeared on the horizon. He said quietly, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" She said, "I am well. I am fine." He put his hand on her face very carefully and looked at her and said nothing for a moment because there was too much to say and he trusted silence to carry some of it. Then he said, "Dorothy, thank you." She raised an eyebrow. "I do not think I am the one to be thanking." He said, "You are, you stayed. Thank you for staying." She covered his hand with hers and held it against her cheek and said, "I am glad I did." The winter was warm in the way that only the interior of a home can be warm when there is real life being lived in it. Dorothy made changes to the upstairs room nearest their bedroom, which had been a spare boarder's room and would now become the nursery. She painted it herself on a cold December afternoon, a pale warm yellow, and Louis had come in halfway through and taken the brush from her because she was reaching too high on the wall, and he was worried about her balance on the step stool. And she had let him finish the upper half while she did the lower, and they had stood back afterward and looked at the yellow room in the afternoon light and said nothing for a while. Clara came back to Caldwell for the birth, arriving on the stage in the last week of March 1880, full of energy and warmth and the particular bossy helpfulness of an adoring younger sister. Preston had stayed in Santa Fe but had sent a letter so affectionate and genuinely warm that Louis had read it twice and said, "Your brother-in-law is a good man," and Dorothy had said, "He always has been." Clara was smart enough to notice. The baby was born on the 7th of April, 1880, a boy. He was strong and loud and had Dorothy's dark eyes and Louis's coloring, and the first time Louis held him he stood very still with the child against his chest, and his face did something that Dorothy, watching from the bed, had to look away from for a moment because it was almost too much to see, too complete, too real, the face of a man who had come back from somewhere very far away. They named him Elias, after the boy Louis had lost at Franklin. Dorothy had suggested it quietly one evening in February when they were talking about names, and Louis had gone very still when she said it, and then he had said, "Yes, if you are certain," and she had said she was, and the name had settled between them like something meant. Clara stayed for 3 weeks and cried again at the naming, which had been a small ceremony at the church with the minister and a few friends. She held Elias for as long as anyone would let her, and told Dorothy that she was the strongest woman she had ever known, which made Dorothy laugh, which made Clara cry again. When Clara left on the eastbound stage at the end of April, she stood on the street beside the stage door and looked at Louis and said, very seriously, "You take good care of them." Louis said, "Every day." She hugged him then, which surprised him, and whispered something in his ear that Dorothy could not hear, and when Clara pulled back, Louis looked moved in a way that he immediately tried to cover with his usual composure, which did not entirely work. Dorothy decided not to ask what Clara had said, because some things were between the people who had said and heard them, and she trusted both of them. The summer of 1880 was good. The boarding house ran steadily. Elias grew at the alarming rate babies grow, becoming first a creature of pure need, and then gradually something more specific, a small person with opinions and preferences, and the early suggestion of a personality. He was, from very early on, intensely interested in everything and easily delighted, which Dorothy privately thought he got from her, and Louis privately thought he got from Dorothy, which was the same thought arriving from different directions. Louis had renegotiated his arrangement with Cal Reeder that spring. He no longer rode the cattle drives, which meant he was home through the summer, which he had asked for specifically. Reeder had understood, because Reeder was a man who respected the things worth staying home for. Louis managed the outfit from Caldwell, overseeing the planning and logistics and personnel, which suited him well and kept him present. He had also, quietly, been putting money aside toward buying a parcel of land north of town. Not a grand ambition, just a small piece of prairie land where, someday, he thought they might build a place of their own. Not that the boarding house was not home. It was home, completely and without question. But he wanted something with their name on the deed, something that was not just the house Dorothy had inherited, but a thing they had chosen together and built together from the ground up. He told her about it in the fall, sitting at the kitchen table after supper while Elias slept upstairs and the house was quiet. He laid out the numbers as he had them, explained what he had saved and what he thought the parcel would cost and what the timeline might look like. He watched her face while he talked because her face was always the thing he read most carefully. She said when he finished, "How long have you been thinking about this?" he said. "Since about February." She said, "And you did not say anything until now because," he said, "I wanted to know I could actually do it before I said I wanted to." She looked at him steadily. "Louis, you do not have to have everything figured out before you share it with me." He said, "I know that. I am working on knowing it." She said, "Work faster." But she was looking at the numbers he had written down, and he could see her interest in them, her practical intelligence moving over the figures. And after a moment she said, "If we sold the east parcel now, we could pay off the remaining loan amount and still have enough left with your savings to make the down payment on the north parcel." He said, "I had the same thought." She said, "You want to sell the east parcel?" He said, "Only if you do." She was quiet for a moment. He could see her thinking about her father, about what the land meant, about the particular weight of inherited things. Then she said, "I think my father would prefer I use it for something instead of just holding it. He was a practical man." Louis said, "From everything you have told me about him, yes." She said, "Write to Holly's." He said, "Are you certain?" She looked at him and said, "Yes, write to Holly's and let's build something." The east parcel sold to Bernard Holly's in December of 1880 for $400, slightly less than his original offer, but still enough to clear the loan and leave a meaningful sum for the north parcel. Louis negotiated the purchase of the land with a rancher named Tibbet, who was moving his family to Colorado and willing to sell at a fair price. The deed was signed in January of 1881, and Louis brought it home to Dorothy and put it on the kitchen table, and they looked at it together. Their names on the document side by side, Louis James Shepard and Dorothy Me Shepard. And the land was real and the names were real, and Dorothy said, quietly, "This is good," and Louis said, "Yes, it is." They did not build immediately. It would take time and planning and more savings, and the boarding house needed them through the spring drive season. But on a Sunday afternoon in March, Louis hitched Cass to the small wagon they had acquired the previous year and drove Dorothy and Elias, who was nearly a year old now and greatly interested in everything that moved out to the north parcel, to walk it. The land was flat in the way Kansas land is flat, which is to say it was not featureless but rather full of a particular kind of subtle variation. The slight rise and fall of the prairie, the places where the grass was thicker, the small creek that cut along the eastern edge of the parcel and was full of cold, clear water. It was a March afternoon, and the wind was coming, but the sky was that specific Kansas blue that appears in early spring before the full warmth arrives. Very clear, very high, enormous. Dorothy stood on the land with Elias on her hip and the wind pulling at her hair where it had come loose from its pins, and she turned slowly, looking at all of it, the flat expanse of grass and sky and the dark line of the creek and the faint line of Caldwell to the south, and she said, "Right there, where the ground rises a little, that is where the house should be." Louis looked where she was pointing, at the slight elevation above the creek. It was a good choice. Good drainage, good view, the creek accessible but not too close. He said, "You are right about that." She said, "I usually am." He looked at her, standing on the land with their son on her hip in the March wind, and he thought about October of 1877, about riding into Caldwell on Cass with nothing, and about the boarding house and the room at $1.50 a week, and the landlady with the clear brown eyes who had told him supper was at 6. And he thought about Franklin and about his mother and about all the years of drifting that had somehow ended exactly here. And something in his chest was so full it was almost uncomfortable, in the way that very good things sometimes press against the limits of what you can contain. He said, "Dorothy." She looked at him, sensing something in his voice. He said, "I want you to know that I am grateful, every day, for all of it, for you." She looked at him for a moment with that clear, steady gaze that had never once been easy to read and had always been worth the reading, and then she shifted Elias to her other hip and came and stood beside Louis and took his free hand with her free hand and said, "I know, so am I." Elias, from his position on his mother's hip, reached out and grabbed a fistful of Louis's coat and held on, which was what he did with things he liked, and Louis put his arm around Dorothy, and the three of them stood on the slight rise above the creek on the March prairie in the blue Kansas afternoon, and the wind came and the grass bent, and the sky was very large and everything was very complete. The construction of the house on the north parcel began in the summer of 1881. Louis and two men from the Reader outfit, a quiet, capable Mexican hand named Domingo, and a young man named Webb who was 18 and eager to learn any trade that involved heavy lifting, began framing in June. Cal Reeder had lent the men and their time in exchange for Louis taking an additional season as his planning foreman, which was a trade that suited everyone. Dorothy designed the interior layout, which she did with a series of careful pencil drawings on the kitchen table of the boarding house, and Louis built from her plans with the kind of meticulous attention he gave to every physical task, which was the attention of a man who understood that the things you build are the things that outlast you. It was a proper house. 4 rooms downstairs and 3 upstairs, with a front porch facing east and a back porch facing west so you could sit in the morning light or the evening light depending on your preference. The kitchen was large because Dorothy intended to feed people in it for the rest of her life. There was a parlor with a fireplace and room for the good chairs and Louis's books and Dorothy's sewing things. There were bedrooms enough for a family larger than they currently were, which was an optimism built into the architecture, and Louis had built them with full ceilings and real windows and the care of someone building for permanence. The boarding house, when the family house was ready, was not abandoned. Dorothy hired a capable widow named Mrs. Beaumont, who had arrived in Caldwell the previous year and had been working at a restaurant, to manage the day-to-day operations. Dorothy remained involved in the business, kept the books, made decisions, checked in regularly. But the Shepard house became a place she managed rather than a place she lived, and this distinction was its own kind of growth. They moved into the house on the north parcel in October of 1881, exactly 3 years after Louis had first arrived in Caldwell. They moved with their belongings in the wagon, and Elias rode between them on the bench seat and watched everything with his enormous dark eyes, and occasionally said the words he currently knew, which were not many but were deployed with great confidence. They drove out to the parcel in the golden October afternoon, and Louis carried Dorothy over the threshold of the front door in the old tradition, which she had protested was unnecessary, and then had allowed with a dignity that made him smile. And they set the first piece of furniture, the kitchen table, down in the kitchen and stood back and looked at the room, and Dorothy said, "This is ours," and Louis said, "Yes." Life on the north parcel was different from the boarding house in ways both practical and profound. There was quiet here, the kind of quiet you can only find when you are far enough from a town that its constant noise does not reach you, and what you hear instead is wind and birds and the creak and the sound of your own household. Dorothy had always thought she might find the quiet difficult. She was used to the motion and company of the boarding house, but instead she found it restoring, like water after a long dry season. Louis had a vegetable garden by the second spring, tended with the same methodical care he gave to everything, and it was productive in a way that pleased him greatly. He also kept 2 horses now besides Cass, a mare named July who Dorothy rode with comfort and confidence, having learned horsemanship in her father's time, and a young gelding Louis was breaking gently for Elias' eventual use, years from now, a project he had named Patience, which was both the horse's name and an accurate description of the undertaking. Elias grew. He grew in the alarming fast way children grow when you love them, so that the person you see every day is always slightly further along than you expect, always one more word, one more skill, one more piece of himself becoming clear. By 2, he was talking without stop. By 3, he was following Louis around the property with the devotion of a small satellite, learning the name of every tool and the purpose of every task, and asking why with a frequency that was simultaneously exhausting and wonderful. He had Louis's attention to detail and Dorothy's directness, and his own particular joy, which belonged to neither of them and was entirely his own. He laughed easily and often, which Dorothy considered the most important inheritance she could have given him, though she would not have put it that way. There was a moment in the spring of 1883 that Louis would remember for the rest of his life. He was working on the fence along the creek pasture on a bright March morning, driving posts in the hard ground with a heavy mallet, and Elias 3 years old, and in his coat and boots, was sitting on a fence rail watching with the complete absorption of a creature who has found his primary area of interest. Louis had been working steadily for an hour and had stopped to wipe his face and rest, and he had looked over at his son on the rail, and Elias had looked back at him with those grave brown eyes, Dorothy's eyes, exactly, and said very seriously, "Papa, you are very strong." And Louis had looked at his son in the March light on their land and said, "Thank you, Elias." And Elias had said, "You are welcome. I'm also strong." Louis had laughed, which made Elias laugh, and the morning had been bright and the work had gone well after that. Dorothy told him she was expecting again in the summer of 1883. She told him the same way she had told him about Elias on the back porch in the evening, watching his face, and his face did the same thing it had done the first time, that large, steady, undivided thing, and he had said the same question first, "Are you well?" And she had said, "I am well," and he had taken her hands and held them. The second child was a girl. She was born in February of 1884 in the house on the north parcel, and she was small and dark-haired and so fierce from the first moment that Dorothy, when she first held her, said, "Oh, there you are," as if she had been expecting this specific person. They named her Frances after Dorothy's mother. Louis had suggested it, quietly, one evening when they were talking about names, offering it carefully as something she might refuse, and Dorothy had gone very still for a moment and then had said yes, which was a yes that meant more than yes, and he had known it. Clara came again for the birth, this time bringing Preston, who finally met Louis and who took to him in the way that comfortable, solid men take to each other, recognizing the type without much need for explanation. Preston was shorter than Louis, rounder, a man of easy laughter and genuine warmth, and the two of them spent an evening on the back porch while Clara and Dorothy were occupied with Frances inside, talking about Santa Fe and Caldwell and the business of freight and cattle, and by the end of it, they had exchanged what amounted to a mutual assessment and approval, which looked like two men smoking on a back porch in the dark and not talking much, but meant something considerably deeper. Clara held Frances for hours and cried appropriately and told Dorothy she was her hero, and Dorothy told Clara to stop crying or she would start crying herself, and Clara said she would not stop crying because she felt like crying, and Dorothy had hugged her sister tightly, and then the two of them had cried together for a little while, which was fine, which was exactly right. Frances grew in her own distinct way, which was nothing like Elias' way and entirely specific to herself. She was quieter as an infant, more watchful, and then when she began to talk, she talked with an economy of words that suggested she had been observing everything for a long time and had now simply decided to comment on what she had found. She was very funny, in a dry, deliberate way that made Louis and Dorothy look at each other across rooms. She was devoted to Elias with a devotion that he accepted with the benign condescension of an older sibling, which she seemed to regard as a reasonable price of admission. She was, by temperament, most like Dorothy, and Louis watched the two of them together sometimes with the kind of feeling that has no adequate name, something that encompasses gratitude and wonder, and the specific pleasure of seeing the person you love most reflected in something new. The boarding house on Main Street in Caldwell continued to operate under Mrs. Beaumont's management through the early 1880s, and continued to be a source of income that supplemented the farm and the ranch work well. In 1884, however, the railroad came through in the way it had always been coming through, and the Kisham Trail cattle drives began to shift northward, toward the newer cow towns further up the line, and Caldwell began to quiet somewhat. It was not dramatic, not a sudden collapse, but a gradual settling of the town's noise level, a thinning of the trail traffic, a change in the character of the place. Dorothy had seen it coming and had adjusted her expectations accordingly. The boarding house was a solid business, but it no longer needed to be their primary income, because the land and Louis's work at the Reeder outfit, which had also evolved, Reeder now focusing more on ranching and less on trail driving, provided a stable and growing base. Dorothy had, in the years since the move to the North Parcel, begun to extend her attention beyond the boarding house. She had started keeping a more substantial garden, selling produce at the Caldwell market, and had found herself increasingly involved in a small informal network of women in and around Caldwell who shared practical resources and information. This was not an organized thing, not yet. It was the kind of thing that happened between frontier women because frontier life required it, the trading of seeds and remedies and labor and knowledge. But Dorothy had a gift for organization and a mind that moved naturally toward problems and solutions, and she had gradually, without particularly intending to, become a central figure in this network. Louis noticed this with the same quiet pleasure he noticed everything about her. He noticed how she was in her element when she was solving a problem, how her face sharpened and brightened when someone brought her something that needed working out. He had always known she was capable. From the first week in the boarding house it had been obvious, but watching her in the context of their life now, with the time and security to extend her capability outward rather than just spend it on survival, was something different. It was her at full height, he thought. Dorothy at the full size of what she actually was. He told her so one evening in the parlor, in the way of a man who has been thinking something for a while and finally says it. He said, "You are very good at this, at all of it. I want you to know that I see it." She had looked up from whatever she was writing at the desk. She had a proper desk now, in the corner of the parlor, which was her territory and which everyone in the household understood to be inviolable, and she had looked at him with the clear brown gaze and said, "Thank you, Louis," in a voice that indicated she was taking the compliment seriously, which was the right response and which he appreciated. She said, "You are good at quite a lot of things yourself." He said, "I know what I am good at." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I am good at the work, I am good at being honest, I am good at showing up." She said, "Yes, you are." And then she added very quietly, "I did not always know if you would be. I thought you might drift." He said, "I know you thought that." She said, "I am glad I was wrong." He said, "So am I." It was a simple conversation, and it was not the first time they had touched on these things, but it settled between them the way good true things settle, not with drama but with the quiet weight of something real being acknowledged, held, kept. In 1885, Elias began his formal schooling at the school in Caldwell, which required a daily ride into town that became one of the rituals of the household. Louis usually drove him in the morning on his way to the reader outfit, and Dorothy collected him in the afternoons. Frances, who was not yet old enough for school and who regarded this arrangement with frank suspicion, used the time Elias was gone to conduct her own private investigations of the property, which Louis had found her undertaking several times in locations that required more agility than a one-year-old should technically possess. Elias was good at school in the way he was good at most things, with obvious interest and a thoroughness that his teacher, a young woman named Miss Healy from Ohio, who had come to Caldwell with genuine idealism, and had found the reality somewhat different from her expectation, told Dorothy was unusual for his age. He read well and did sums well and was, Miss Healy said carefully, very confident in his opinions, which Dorothy took as accurate and did not find troubling. Caldwell in 1885 was a different place from Caldwell in 1878. The great cattle drives had mostly ended. The railroad had reshaped the economy. There were more families now and fewer transient workers, more permanent structures and fewer hastily built establishments. The saloons were still there but more regulated than they had been, and the town had a different feeling, a more settled feeling, which the old-timers who had arrived in the boom years did not always appreciate and the families who had built here welcomed. Louis and Dorothy had built something inside this changing town, and what they had built was solid in the way that things are solid when they are made from real material, the material of work and honesty and forgiveness and daily choosing. There was nothing perfect about their life. There were hard seasons and disagreements and the regular difficulties of running a farm and a business, and raising children in a place where nature and circumstance could shift without warning. There were winters where the cold came down from the north in walls, and the work was brutal and exhausting. There were financial pressures that required careful management and sometimes sacrifice. There were the injustices of the time and place that pressed in from outside, things that neither Louis nor Dorothy could entirely fix: the hard treatment of the Osage, and the Pawnee who had been pressed off their lands by the same frontier expansion that had brought Caldwell into being, the limitations put on women's legal standing that Dorothy had hit more than once in her dealings with banks and courts, the rigid social expectations that dictated what a woman could own or decide or say in rooms where men were making choices that affected her. These things were real, and Dorothy was not a woman who pretended they were not. She named them when she encountered them, and where she could, she pushed back, with the careful strategic precision of someone who knew which battles could be won with the tools at hand, and which required more people and more time. She was not naive about the world. She had never been naive about the world. But she had also never let the world's hardness become the largest thing in her vision, and this was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. Louis, for his part, had found in Caldwell something he had not found since before the war: a sense of place. Not just belonging, which was a thinner thing, but the specific grounded feeling of a man who knows exactly where he stands and what he stands on and who stands beside him. He was a good foreman, a good farmer, a good neighbor. He was the man people came to when a fence needed building properly, or a horse needed a patient hand, or someone needed a problem explained clearly. He was not a man of many words in public, but the words he did say were considered and honest, and in a frontier community that was worth a great deal. He had gone back to praying, not the way he had prayed before Franklin, with the certainty of a young man who had never been given specific reason for doubt, but in a different way, the way of someone who has lived enough to know that certainty is not the same as faith, and that speaking into what might be silence is still, somehow, the honest thing to do. He prayed in the morning, sometimes briefly, before the household woke, standing at the kitchen window looking out at the prairie in the first gray light, saying something quiet and true and not decorative. He prayed in the evenings sometimes. He had told Dorothy about it once, mentioned it casually in passing, and she had looked at him with a quiet attention that was not surprise exactly, but something more like recognition, as if she had seen this coming and was glad it had arrived. By 1887, Elias was 7, and Francis was 3, and the house on the north parcel had the particular character of a house where children have been living long enough to put their mark on it: crayon on the lower section of the parlor wallpaper, a collection of rocks and interesting sticks that Elias kept on the windowsill in his room, Francis's tiny boots always in the wrong place, the specific dents and scratches and warmth that accumulate in a house that is genuinely lived in by people who love each other. Dorothy was 35 in 1887, and Louis was 40, and these were not old ages, but they were the ages at which a person can look back at the span of their life and begin to see the shape of it, the way you can see the shape of a landscape from a certain elevation. Louis had lived enough by 40 to know that the shape of his life was not what he would have drawn for himself at 20, in either the difficult parts or the good ones, and that this was not a failure but simply the nature of things. You did not plan your way into a real life. You arrived in Caldwell on a dun horse in October with a bedroll and a broke past, and you rented a room from a woman with clear brown eyes, and you stayed. One evening in the late spring of 1887, Louis and Dorothy were sitting on the west-facing back porch in the evening light, which was their place and their time, as it had been for years. Elias was inside doing the reading his teacher had assigned him, and Francis was asleep. The prairie was very still in the way it goes still sometimes at dusk, as if it has been holding its breath all day and is finally letting it out. Dorothy said, without particular preamble, "I have been thinking about what my father would make of all this." Louis said, "And," she said, "I think he would like you. He would have been suspicious of you at first because he was suspicious of everyone at first, but he would have liked you once he watched you work for a while. Louis said, "That is a reasonable system." She said, "He would have adored Elias and been absolutely baffled by Francis." Louis said, "Most people are." She smiled. She said, "I think he would have been happy with what I have done with the place. With everything, I hope so." Louis said, "From everything you have told me about him, he would have been proud of you. I am certain of it." She looked at the prairie for a moment and he looked at her. There was a peace in her face that he had watched arrive over years, replacing not happiness. She had always had that. It lived beneath the surface of her even in difficult times, but the particular tension of a person who is not yet sure of their ground. The tension was gone now. She was sure of her ground. She had made the ground. She said, "I almost went to Santa Fe." He said, "I know." She said, "I would have been miserable in Santa Fe." He said, "You would have found a way to be useful anywhere." She said, "That is not the same as being where you belong." He said, "No, it is not." She reached over and took his hand, which was something she did often now, a casual and complete gesture, the gesture of someone who does not have to think about reaching for the person beside them because the reaching has become as natural as breathing. She said, "Louis, I'm going to say something sentimental and I want you to receive it without your face doing that thing." He said, "What thing?" She said, "That thing where you look moved and then immediately try to appear as if you are not moved." He said, "I do not do that." She looked at him. He said, "All right, I will try." She said, "I am glad for every piece of it, even the hard pieces. Even the part where you rode into my boarding house looking like a man who had forgotten what he was doing here. I am glad for all of it, because it brought us here." He held her hand and looked at the prairie going dark in the long western light and did not do the thing with his face. He said, "So am I, Dorothy, every single piece." They sat on the porch until the stars came out, which took a while, because spring evenings in Kansas hold onto their light with the tenacity of something that knows what is coming. The mockingbird that had taken up residence in the cottonwood by the creek ran through its songs in the gathering dark. Somewhere inside the house, Elias finished his reading and went to bed without being told, which was a small miracle. The wind came softly from the southwest, and the grass bent, and the creek made its quiet creak sound, and the stars appeared one by one until there were too many to count. Louis and Dorothy stayed on the porch until it was late and the air had gone cool. They were not talking, mostly. They were simply present, in the specific way of people who have learned that presence itself is the thing, that being in the same place at the same time with full attention, and no performance is the rarest and most valuable form of love. When they finally went inside, Dorothy checked the door locks and blew out the kitchen lamp, and Louis did the same for the parlor, and they came up the stairs together in the dark, and Louis checked briefly on Elias in his room sleeping hard, one arm thrown over the side of the bed, the way he always slept, and Dorothy looked in on Frances, who was so still and so small in her bed that she looked like something carved, though she was not still and small in waking hours by any measure. They went to bed in the room they had shared for 6 years in this house, and for a period before that in the boarding house room they had quietly, without discussion, merged into a shared space in the months before the wedding. The room was dark and the windows were open to the spring air, and Louis fell asleep within minutes, which he always did, the sleep of a man who had made his peace with his days and his past and himself, not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. Dorothy lay awake a little while longer, the way she sometimes did, not with worry but with the particular wakefulness of a mind that processes things at night. She thought about the letter from Clara that was coming next week. Clara had written to say they were expecting again, a third child, and that Preston's freighting business was flourishing in Santa Fe, and would Dorothy and Louis come south to visit before the winter? She thought about the answer she would write, which was yes, they would come, they would bring the children, it had been too long. She thought about the boarding house in town, which Mrs. Beaumont had mentioned was needing some attention to the foundation, and the meeting she had scheduled with the carpenter for Thursday, and the practicalities of the thing. She thought about Elia's upcoming recitation at the school, which he was very serious about, and had been practicing with Louis's patient assistants every evening for a week. She thought about Francis, who had that morning climbed the corral fence and sat on the top rail with the serenity of a person who has conquered something and feels good about it, and had looked at Dorothy with such calm satisfaction that Dorothy had not had the heart to tell her to come down, had simply watched, and had thought, that is what a person looks like when they know exactly who they are. She thought about Louis's hands holding hers on the porch in the evening light. She thought about all the evenings on all the porches, the back porch of the boarding house and this porch, the years of evenings. She thought about a night in August of 1878 when she had sat across from him in the parlor and said she was leaving, and the look on his face, level and controlled and underneath it entirely broken, and she had known it and had still been afraid. She was glad she had stayed. She was glad every day and most nights. She was glad in the way you are glad for things that could have gone differently and didn't. The specific gratitude that comes from knowing the alternate version of the story existed and was averted. She thought about the girl she had been before any of this, before the boarding house and the debt and the fear, before her father died and left her to manage everything alone. She thought about that girl with something like tenderness. She had been capable, that earlier Dorothy, and brave in the specific way of not having much choice. She had built things. She had held on. She had, eventually and after a good deal of internal argument, allowed a quiet drifting man with dark eyes and a broken past to sit at her supper table, and then in her parlor and then in her life, and she had not been wrong to do so. She fell asleep to the sound of the Kansas night, the mockingbird going quieter now, the creek continuing, the wind in the grass, Louis breathing beside her steady and slow as something permanent. In the morning she would write to Clara. She would go into town and speak to the carpenter about the boarding house foundation and update the ledger. She would watch Elias eat breakfast with his particular method of total focus, and she would negotiate with Francis about the appropriate number of rocks that could reasonably be brought into the house from outside, which was a negotiation she conducted every few days and never entirely won. And in the evenings she would sit on the west porch in the last of the light with Louis, and they would talk or not talk and watch the prairie go dark, and it would be, as it always was, enough. More than enough. The life they had made was not a grand life in the sense of greatness or fame or the kind of history that gets written down in newspapers. It was a life made of particular specific things. The smell of good coffee before dawn, the sound of a child learning to read aloud haltingly in the next room, the weight of a hand held in the dark, the satisfaction of a fence built straight and true, the way certain light falls on certain faces at certain hours and stays in the memory forever. Louis Shepard had ridden into Caldwell in October of 1877 with nothing but a horse and a bedroll, and a past he did not know what to do with. He had found, in a boarding house on the main street of a cattle town in Kansas, something he had stopped believing existed, a place where he was exactly himself and was loved for it, exactly as he was, broke past and silenced prayers and all, by a woman who did not require him to be any different and whose love was the steadiest thing he had ever held. Dorothy Graves had built a life from the materials available to her, which were often insufficient and sometimes cruel, and she had built it with the kind of persistent, intelligent will that does not advertise itself but simply continues, and what she had built was real and hers and good. She had nearly walked away from the best of it out of fear, which she had forgiven herself for because fear was not a failure. It was a thing to move through, and she had moved through it. They grew old together in the house on the north parcel, the house above the creek, the house Louis had built from Dorothy's pencil drawings on the kitchen table of the boarding house, and it held them well and long, through seasons and changes and the growing and leaving of children and the quieting that comes after, and it was theirs. Everything was theirs. They had made it together out of what they had and what they were, and it was more than enough. It was a good life. It was the right life. It was the only life, looking back, that either of them could imagine having wanted.